Hello and welcome to another episode of CYC Youth Chat. My name's Andrew, and joining me today on the panel we've got Gabriella, Mark, Ramez and Marina. Today's topic of discussion is the pit. More specifically, how do we get out of the pit? So in our lives, we often face these issues, we get to stages where we feel down, there's something that's come up. You just wake up in the morning and you don't really feel the same. We really want to discuss how do we get out of this stage and how do we get out of this cycle. So to kick it off, I want to start with the first question. What specifically are pits in our life? And what are some examples you guys have come across, or what examples you guys have faced?
Well, I think specifically, there's a difference between tribulation and the pit. Sometimes they can, it can be together, but I know in times in my life, the pit would just been there's not really something that's specifically bugging me, but I just feel so down, I've reached a breaking point, I'm just tired, and I don't have much strength to continue or whatever. So it can be anything, it can be just an accumulation of all these things that have just come up, and then there's just a breaking point where you just can't anymore, or it can be a tribulation where you feel you can't go on. But I think it doesn't specifically have to be a tribulation or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what Gabriella said. I think maybe it's a point in your life where, like you said, you wake up in the morning and you just you don't feel the joy, you feel broken, you feel more than anything else, you feel need of healing, you feel hopeless. I think that's really when you've hit rock bottom and you feel there's no hope of getting out, kind of thing.
And I feel sometimes these pits can come when we're very spiritually low, when we feel we can't redeem ourselves, or we can't rectify what we've done. And so we feel we just keep going in this pattern, and we convince ourselves that we're okay, but get to a point you wake up and you just I can't do this anymore. I can't stop pretending everything's okay. I can't continue with this service. I can't continue, and
so there are two reasons you said you can't fix and you're feeling spiritually low. What are some other reasons why you feel you'd be in a pit?
Well, I think it's exactly what Gabriella said. I know in my personal spiritual life, when for example, I don't do my prayers at night, or I don't read the Agbeya, or I'm straying away from the Lord, that's when I feel that everything starts going bad. And the exact opposite is true as well. So when I'm true to my prayers and when I'm true to my canon or whatever with my confession, Father, if I'm following it to the T, God rewards that, and I think He looks upon that favorably, and it works both ways. So if you stray away from the agreements you've had with your confession, Father, then your life starts to go down and you fall into the pit.
But what happens if you feel you're doing everything you can, everything right in your spiritual life, and you feel that way? You feel really broken still, and you feel does that mean you're not genuine in what the practices that you've been doing, or the canon that you have with your confession, Father? Or is it mean that it's God just wants you to persevere, or it's something that Christ wants to teach you a lesson out of it?
I think that's a very common spiritual warfare that we all go through. The story of Mother Teresa, who it says that she didn't her prayers. It felt like her prayers were so dry for 11 years, and God wasn't answering her prayers, and she was going through a state of distress for a very, very long time. If you look at her service, her service continued to flourish. Even though she couldn't find that joy in her life, her service was still blossoming and growing continuously. So I think it's just a state of trial from the Lord.
But what if nothing is flourishing? Does that mean that you're doing something wrong? Or?
I think that, everyone, as Mark said, everyone falls into that stage, and we've seen it. We have the examples in the Bible. There are a number of stories where the saints, they follow God's word to the T. For example, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They followed the word that God gave them, and they rejected Nebuchadnezzar when he offered the meats and wines and things like that, and they followed him, and in the end they got thrown into the fire. But I think the shining light and the thing that we should always use as motivation is that God will save us in the end. So God was with them in the fiery furnace, and He's the one that saved them in the end. So, we all know that God gives us tribulation to what we can handle, and He'll never give us something that will break us down until we're completely gone. We can always handle what God gives us. It's
that psalmist says many are a lot is the chastening of the Lord, but He hasn't handed me over to death, and He chastens me and things like that. So it's so it is a chastening thing, and I think one essential part of being in the pit is perseverance, with what you're doing. I was talking to an Ambuna the other day. He's we all go through spiritually low phases, but you have to ensure that when you are spiritually low, you're doing everything you can, so that way you're not completely going down. If you're doing everything you can and everything's right, regardless of what you feel or what is going on around you, if you're still continuing in that, like there will be a point of escalation. Whereas if you don't continue to like persevere, there won't be that point of escalation afterwards. Like
There's also another issue which Mez sort of touched on there with Daniel, and I'll ask Marina. It's the whole idea of the innocent pit. So, say for instance, you've been going on very well, you're going perfectly, you're not doing anything wrong, but all of a sudden something happens against you, something happens, and it puts you in the pit, and it's not even your fault, and all of a sudden you've got someone to blame, right? How do you handle that situation?
I think with a situation like that, you've got to realize that everything that involves your state, it can't be dependent on someone else. And with a pit, it's more of a self-battle, and your attitude and how you respond, I think, is very important. So you could either look at it in a very negative light and be like, why is this happening to me, God? And I'm sure the devil's going to bring this big burden and temptation to be like, it's this person's fault. Where is God in my pit? Why does this happen when I do everything my confession father asks me to do? But I think God allows these situations to happen. He allows it to happen so that we may grow and that we may take the blessing of a pit. But I think it's as soon as we realize that, hey, the situation is not as bad as I can make it out to be, it could be a lot better. And that perseverance, we may not see it then, but God, in the long run, He should surely bless it, and He will. But I think it really depends on our attitude and how we respond, and try and make excuses for others rather than try to bring them down with you, because that's all the devil wants. So.
Yeah, that's true. And just like using, like what you said about our state can't be dependent on others, like just using an example from the Bible, Job, for instance, he was innocent and he was a righteous man. It says that like God Himself was so proud of Job that He went to the devil and He says, have you seen my servant Job? You can't take him down. Like try your best, but he won't go down. And the devil takes absolutely everything from him. And then his wife even says to Job, why don't you just roll on the ground, curse God and die? And he says something really beautiful, like something that really touches me every time I read it. He says, shall we only accept the good from the Lord and not accept the bad? So he refused to blame God, and instead he understood like God's nature, like the reason why he was being tested, the reason why he was being trialed in like the fiery furnace kind of thing, like Daniel and his friends in the fiery furnace. Like it was because God was trying to like make him reveal something even more divine to him in the end.
Having that understanding, so the verse in Romans, I'm not sure the exact order, but knowing that out of tribulation comes perseverance, and out of perseverance comes patience, and just know that every tribulation that God gives us is blessing. So I think some of the desert fathers, they actually say that we should look forward to being tested and fall through tribulations in the world, because out of that we know comes blessing from God.
And I think it's that point of realization. Like there's always that like phase in your pit or whatever that you're like, you're blaming everything and whatever, and you're just like, why am I here? And you're really depressed and whatever. But there's always a point in time where you're like, I need to change this. Like I'm in need of healing. I'm in need of God. I'm in need of a change in my heart, like a transformation. And when you cry out to the God and to God, in all honesty and whatever, like I could think that's a really like you need to have that turning point, because it can go either way. Like Marina said, like you can have it in a negative light and it will take you down. But like then again, if you're crying out to God, then like you can.
There's also another question which sort of stems from that. How do we know if it's spiritually motivated at the start or self-motivated? How does it work? Should it be something that within me I just say, oh, I need to change, or how does it work? What do you guys think about that?
I think the verse that sums this up specifically is Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. So I think, as Marina was saying before, if we try and blame others, or we try and understand it from our own light, and we try and solve the problems with our own understanding and say, oh, you did this and I did this and this was the reason why, that's when we fall, and that's when we dig the pit deeper, because we're straying further away from God. But if we look at it from the perspective through God, talk to your confession father through the sacraments, we have prayer, we have confession, we have the repentance, we have spiritual leaders and others around us, our youth and our friends. If we use them to guide us and not lean on our own understanding, then I think God reveals it to us, what the cause is or where the solution is, and then we can go from there, I think.
But I really think like what Mess said is exactly right. But to answer your question, I think it's both. Like it's not just spiritually motivated. You know, you can't just hear a sermon and, you know, like we know that the parable of the seeds. You know, sometimes the sower sowed the seeds, and sometimes it fell in good ground, sometimes it fell in thorny ground. You know, like it has to be a self-motivated thing as well as a spiritually motivated thing. So I can't just listen to a sermon and expect to be changed. You know, I really need to take in the words of the sermon. I really need to take in the Bible reading and the verses that I read like that day kind of thing. Yeah, and really act and really apply it to my life practically.
It's like the prodigal son. He didn't just make the decision. He didn't just sit there and like, oh yeah, I know I need to change, but like didn't really do anything about it. He went and he made active steps. He thought about it. He's like, okay, I'm just going to go to my dad. I'm going to say, you know, if I can be a servant, whatever, like, you know, and then he went and took action.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
you know, a lot of the time we're like, okay, we listen to him like, that's so touching, that's so relevant to me right now. Like, you know, but we don't really do anything about it. Like,
on that, I think the important thing we have to understand is that for any blessings, anything for happen, it's our own effort and God's grace as well.
Yeah.
We can't put everything and say, it's the will of God, I'll let God do everything.
Yeah,
we have to put
exactly.
in our own effort, and together that's where blessings comes, and that's where...
I agree with Mark. I think it's both spiritual and self. Obviously, our bodies are really weak, and if we depend on the spiritual side, sin will get in the way, and you won't get out of the pit because the devil will tie you down. So I think we have to remind ourselves that the body is so limited, and especially with the why questions with the pit, why does it happen? It's God, like we have to remember that our minds are so limited to God's understanding. And so we both need to work on the spiritual and the self-motivated to get us through it, because we can't just depend on the spiritual when the self could like weigh down the spiritual. It could let it down, it could prevent it, could be a barrier, right? Like it could be a negative thing more than a positive thing towards the spiritual.
Yeah, I think a lot of that, like that self-motivation comes in, like a most practical way I could think of is like to be self-motivated is just like in taking the Holy Communion. Like, you know, we come, like Gabriella and Mez and Marina have been saying the whole time, like we have to come into the presence of God. Like we have to really acknowledge that we can do nothing of our own understanding. So like in communion, you know, you are like literally, like you're physically touching the body and blood of Christ. You are taking him in and you are taking in his presence kind of thing. But it's not enough to just take it in without acknowledging that he is going to transform you kind of thing. Like to take communion, like just because, you know, everyone's doing it, just get into the line and it's routine on a Sunday is not enough. It has to be, you have to be approaching communion with the knowledge that I am now coming into contact with the body and blood of Christ, and I need that, like need his body and blood to change me. I'm, like Gabriella said, I'm in need of healing. That's one of the most important things that we really have to acknowledge, that I am in fact in need of healing all the time, and healing comes like through the contact with the body and blood of Christ.
And like think about it, like we go and have communion once a week, like it's a constant thing. Like it's not like you're going to be healed and that's it, like you're healed for the rest of your life. Like there will always be these phases, and they're always like God's mercies are new every morning, and God's healing is new every morning, and God's, you know, grace and love and everything it's new every morning. So it's like a constant, like it's a constant renewal, and it's a constant like process of like perfection and things like that. So like we should not lose heart when like we feel God's healing whatever, and then the next day we don't feel it. Like it's something that we should be seeking out. And I think sometimes these things are a blessing, because in those pits, like you realize how much more you're in need of that healing, and how much more you're in need of like how weak you are compared to God, how strong God is. And like it's good because it's like a way of God chasing after our own heart, like, and it's like more of a blessing. And like, yeah.
I like those points. I think we'll wrap it up for this half, but I really like what we've discussed basically is what are pits in our life, and you know, why do these pits happen. But you know, moving on to the next stage, I really want to get into like steps of how do we get out of these pits. But you know, thanks for joining us this half, and we'll see you guys after the break. Thanks. So welcome back to Youth Chat. As you know, today we've been discussing the whole idea of the pits, and I just want to get straight into it, right? So I feel like constantly we're being told, you know, Christ died for us. He came and saved us from our sins. But too often we don't really understand the relevance of this, and we don't really understand the relevance of Christ's death and the relation to that to pits in our life. So, you know, people are like, oh look, this was 2,000 years ago. You know, what relevance does this have to me, and what help is it at all? So that's what I want to ask you guys. What relevance does Christ's death and resurrection have And what hope does it give us to be able to have the ability to get out of the pits in our life? Alright. Jumping the gun.
Always the best example is Jesus Christ in our lives, and I think his death on the cross and him conquering death could be like we could apply our pits to what happened to him. And I think Amabulus was here recently, and he said that during miserable times in our lives, during gloomy times and basically pits in our life, we should remind ourselves that Christ conquered death. He already conquered these pits, and he conquered the one that mattered most, and that we should always apply his greatness and his victory and say that we've already won this pit. I've already won this pit, even though I feel like this is it, this is the end of my life. I don't know, you know, the negative thoughts we get.
Like 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1 to 7, it says like, it's exactly what you're saying now. It's like, as much as we partake of the sufferings of Christ, so like when we are in those pits, we are partaking of the suffering of Christ. We also, if we are partaking in the suffering, that means we're also going to be partaking in the resurrection, the joy, the comfort, and the consolation that comes with the resurrection. So like, for example, like Christ felt every single feeling that we felt, like the sorrow, the mourning, the loneliness. Like, you know, he was by himself when he was going to the cross. Like no one was there. They were just all watching him, kind of thing. Like, and like all things like in Gethsemane, no one was staying awake to pray, or things like that. Like he went through every single like thing that we went through. So like when we go through it, we go through it with Christ. Like as opposed to like, it doesn't mean that our life is going to be void of suffering. Our life is going to be void of like any sort of like negative kind of situation, but it means that we're going through it with Christ, and we're also going to partake of the comfort and consolation if we do persevere. Like if we don't persevere, we might not ever partake of that.
So can I get from you guys like sort of 3 practical, I'm putting you on the spot a bit, but 3 really practical steps to get out of the pit? What do you guys think?
But just on the like the whole idea of the death of Christ, because like we're talking about the death of Christ, you know, Christ conquered death, Christ, you know, defeated sin, and he died for us on the cross, and he went into Hades, and, you know, like broke the chains of Hades and everything. But like it's not all about that. Like that's not where it ended. You know, if that's where the story ended, then like, you know, we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about it, because we know what happened after that. We know that he resurrected from the dead, and that's the where he conquered death. That was the point where all hope for all mankind was renewed, was restored. So I think like we have to remember that where the hope comes from is that after every cross that we bear in our lives, there is the hope of, and the truth, the knowledge of a resurrection. And I think that's something that Amabulus, when he came, he really like, you know, like smashed into us. He really wanted to drum into our minds, kind of thing, that we should never feel like we are hopeless. And he showed us a video where a guy was talking about, you know, all the seemingly hopeless situations within the Bible, and he spoke about Lazarus died, you know, the three friends of Daniel were in the furnace, the Joshua was faced a wall in front of him, and then Jesus died. But after every single one of these situations, you know, God showed his almighty power in it, and he restored them all. And I think like, and then one of the most beautiful quotes in that whole video that he showed us was, he says, a hopeless situation is for God is not, you know, impossible, but it's favorable. Like with God, that like God puts a comma where we would usually put a full stop. So I think it's really important to remember that it never ended at the cross. The cross would they did not end Jesus' life. It did not end like that, because Christianity would never have blossomed if it ended at the cross.
And so that verse, my strength is made perfect in weakness. And like what is perfect in God's eyes is so much more perfect than what is in our eyes. So like, how perfect is that? Like, and one of the blogs on Father Anthony Messina, a lady was talking about healing and all that stuff, and she said like, when God heals, he gives a whole healing. So it's like it's like a whole, like,
it's not half.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's the first point to your thing, like, you know, that like you asked, what are 3 practical ways that we can, you know, like renew this hope? And that's the first thing, that if I'm feeling down and I'm feeling like I'm in a pit, to acknowledge all this, that my strength is made perfect in weakness. You know, for God, a hopeless situation is not impossible, but it's favorable. You know, God prefers that in our lives. Like that's where God will renew his power. So
just to add to what Marina and Gabby were saying before, so the thing that's so unique about Christianity and our God is that God himself came down as a man and took our form on the earth exactly as we're living, and he went through all the sorrow, he went through all the pain, just as what Gabby was saying before, and he's been through all the emotions that we feel in our pit. And I think that's unique about Christianity, in that we can talk to a God who's related, who has been through what we've been through. And in terms of practical steps, like you said, I think prayer and talking to our God who has been through what we've been through, exactly what we've been talking about, is a really practical step, and something that the church encourages,
Exactly.
I think. Yeah.
And going off that honest prayer as well. Like if you feel like you're angry at God for putting you in this pit, or for like not feeling like you've been healed or whatever, telling him that, like, God, I don't feel healed. Like, why am I feeling like this? Why are you doing this to me? But the whole, like, the best thing about that is that you always leave the prayer with some sort of peace about, you know, that question kind of thing. Like David, like you look at all his Psalms, when he's going and he's so upset, you know, with God and whatever, like you see at the end of the Psalm, he's always leaving like rejoicing in God and praising God. So like it just goes to show that when we do take that honest feeling to God, then like it will always end in like a peace and like an understanding.
Yeah, and I think it's important to build that relationship with God. So it's not like you're talking to a greater being, or you're talking to anyone that's looking down upon you. I think exactly what Gabby said, you can have a conversation
like
with
God.
God. And
Like it reminds me of the verse St. Augustine said, only that which was assumed can be saved. So he's saying like Christ came, he assumed all these things. He assumed the worries, he assumed the stress, he assumed like temptation. All these things came to him. But he did this so he can save us. And that's, I think, the key. We have to remember that when we go through this, Jesus also went through the same thing and even harder. So he's a good person that we can call upon. Just like when we're down, you know, say we have a car accident or something, you call your mum, you call your dad. But, you know, what better person to call upon than our Father, who's assumed the hardest things.
Yeah, I think what Mez pointed, like, and what everyone on this panel has pointed on, like very significantly, is that, you know, he wants us to know that we can talk to him. You know, like, why else would he, like, can't become the incarnate God? Why else would he come down on earth? Like, I'm not just your Father in heaven. Like, I'm not a greater being than you. Obviously he is, but, you know, like, I want you to talk to me. I'm your friend, and I want to go through the same things as you, so that like we can have this conversation. We can heal. Like, I can heal you. I want you to ask me to heal you. And Michael J. Gordon writes on like a lot of Pauline literature, and he talks about the verses in Philippians 2, and he says what he says about it. He says, Christ, who is equal to God, did not consider it robbery to be equal to God, but rather humbled himself and emptied himself for the sake of mankind, for the sake of obedience, even obedience unto death. So he humbled himself for our sakes, kind of thing.
A practical thing that I personally do when I'm in a pit is I remember all the good things that God has done for me in my life, and all the moments of joy and the sweetness of Christ. And like when you think of those moments, I don't think there's anything that takes your breath away more than that. And it's a practical hope, it's a vision to look forward to, that God will work the same miracles in your life in the future. And it's only until you remove the focus from yourself and you direct it back to God, and you go, God, everything that I do, every situation I face is for your glory. So if I'm in this pit, help me to glorify you during this pit, and help me to be patient and to persevere. Just like it says in Isaiah, but those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. So it's a chance to get closer to God. It's a chance to look at him in a different light, even though it's tribulation, even though it could be self-motivated tribulation.
You know, it's funny, you talk about like experiences, but sometimes, like, you know, we ourselves, we're just like the Israelites. Like, you know, we have these miracles, massive miracles happen in our lives, yeah? Like the parting of the Red Sea. And they keep going, and they fall again, and they completely forget about what just happened in their lives. And it's like this continual thing, like God's like, you know, I just gave you this, you know, I just helped you out. Why don't you just remember? And so, yeah, I think that the whole idea of remembering and setting up sort of pillars in our life, altars, you know, and wells, you know, where the places where we find salvation, I think just remembering that, yeah, it's a very good technique. I like that.
And going off that, like you said, like that's the best sort of evangelism, when you're in that, like that pit and that tribulation and whatever, and people see you like still rejoicing in God and persevering with God. Like they notice that difference and that hope that you have, and they question that, and that I think to me is the best evangelism, because that is faith in action. And like just another point, like a practical point, like confession as well. Like I know so many points where I've been in like a pit or something, and I feel in my heart I should go to confession, but I don't even want to confess. And I'll go to Abuna and be like, I don't even feel like confessing right now. And like Abuna always has the right thing to say to me at that point, and like that will always like refresh me and renew me. And I feel like he doesn't even know that, you know, that's exactly what I needed to hear. Like Christ really speaks through that. And so many times I've walked into confession saying, I don't want to be here, I don't want to do this, like this isn't going to help me. But I've walked out being like what a fool I was, because that was exactly what I needed, and that's exactly what I needed to hear, and that's the exact guidance that I needed, and the exact motivation. Like so many times the woman will just comfort me and, you know, say like, you know, what you're in isn't really that bad, like, and put me in perspective. And I think that like it's such an important thing, because sometimes like when we see it through other eyes, or like other people like shed some light on it, like we realize like maybe why God's doing it, or how we can get out of it, or, you know, like really like that we've been feeling sorry for ourselves this whole time. So I think it's like a really important like.
So going on from that, after you've been comforted and after you've sort of climbed your way out of this pit of yours, how do you keep that hope? And, you know, like, is it a choice? Like, how do you keep this? Like, keep it going?
I think, well, like we said, so the main idea, we now 3 practical points that we talked about, is turning to God in however way or form. All of the 3, the main thing that was involved was turning to God. And I think it's important also to look at it from another perspective. So the verse here in Romans, it says, bless those who persecute you, and bless and do not curse. And I think looking at pits in our lives as well in that perspective is beneficial as well, because every time we fall into the pit, or every time someone curses us, or every time we're down, we look towards God, or we should look towards God. And I think that's why when we mentioned before that the Desert Fathers, they praised whenever they were tempted, or whenever they were in tribulations, they always look towards God. And I think that's important, in that whenever we fall, or whenever we're tempted and we fall into a pit, we look towards God, and that's our opportunity to look towards Him. So not necessarily looking at pits as bad things, because every time we have a pit or whatever, we have that opportunity to look towards God.
Yeah, I think like Mez said before, and like you guys said before, you and Marina, like it's that memory of, you know, God's love in your past kind of thing. Like I heard a nice quote once. It was saying like, you know, never forget God's love in your past, His power, His presence in your present, and His power for your future. So because God, you know, like was so gracious and generous to me in my past, I have no doubt, I have absolute faith that He will continue to deal with me in the same manner going into my future.
So there's a little question that stems from that. What if you feel like you have no miracles, or you have no examples in your life that you can draw upon? What happens then?
Well, you ask God to show you. Like, ask God, like, what have you done good in my life? Like, I can't see it. Like I think it's just all about honest prayer. Like, God, like, I feel like you haven't done anything good for me, you know? And I'm sure He will reveal, because God has always been doing good for us, you know what I mean? Like, so I think that it's more of an honest, like...
And it's what Marina said earlier, like, there is no better example than Jesus Himself, you know? So, we can't find it in our own lives, and we can look on the example of Jesus.
Also, I think there are so many miracles in our day-to-day life that we belittle. Just there's simple things that we just are so blinded towards. So simple sacrament, like Holy Communion, that happens every Sunday, but we take it for granted. We don't acknowledge that as a miracle. There's so many things in our lives that are so small. Even looking at nature and how did God create the whole world? There's so many little things that we could look for hope through other miracles. It necessarily doesn't have to be ours, because when we focus on ourselves, it allows us to compromise, allows the devil to come in. So it doesn't necessarily have to be our own miracle.
I think on that, Amber Bullis gave a sermon on that point exactly. He was talking about how when Moses was born and he was put in the basket in the water, that water and that waterfall had the power to flip the basket in a second. The baby could have drowned and the baby could have died straight away. But God not only saved Moses in the basket, but He also directed it to the kingdom of Pharaoh before his palace. And I think just having that perspective that God is working miracles every day of our life, just exactly as Marina said, is something that we should always keep in the back of our mind, and know that God is love. So it's not God is love when we're good to Him, or God is love this or that. God is love full stop, and know that God is always
And
be a
look at
blessing.
like look at Joseph. Like he got thrown into the pit by his brothers, and he went away, and like he was in this like, and nothing good was happening. Got thrown into prison. Exactly. Like, you know, it just kept going further and further and further. Like what he did was like he still persevered through that. So I think also like on top of all those things, perseverance in our spiritual lives. And if you really feel like you can't do something, you can't pray, whatever, watch a sermon, watch a saint movie, watch a Bible movie. Like those things always inspire us to pray, or always like move us, or like when we look at like, you know, the hurt in other people's lives and how they, you know, like came through it, like is always such an inspiring thing to watch, like, and always moves you to you.
Yes, I think the key takeaway from today is like just find the blessing in the pit, and instead of making it a pit, turn that pit into a well, turn it into everlasting spring of water. Like, you know, a well is a pit, but the only difference is there's water coming out. So I think looking at the negatives and turning into positives, I think that's the most important thing. So thank you very much for joining us today. It was a great episode, and I'm looking forward to the next one. See you guys soon.